The first thing Ezra Cole heard was her breathing, ragged and uneven. The sound a body makes when it has already given up arguing with pain and is simply enduring it. And that sound followed him across the hard-packed dirt of Briar Hollow, like a confession no one else wanted to claim, because the town had already decided what she was and what she deserved, and Ezra, standing there with the sun low and cruel behind him, felt the old, familiar weight settle into his chest, the weight of knowing that whatever came next would change him, whether he wanted it to or not, and she was slumped against the splintered side of a freight wagon, wrists raw where rope had been cut too late, dress torn and stained with dust and dried blood, her dark hair clinging to her face as if even it wanted to hide her. And when she lifted her eyes to him, there was no defiance left in them, only a trembling plea that carried more force than any gun, because when she whispered, "Hold me. Use me. Just get me out of here," it was not an invitation but a surrender. The words of someone who had learned that survival sometimes meant offering yourself up to the least cruel option left standing. And Ezra felt the town behind him without turning, felt their judgment like heat on his back. Men who spat and women who crossed themselves and children who had learned early how to stare at suffering without seeing it. All of them bound together by the same lie that what happened to her was necessary, their world clean. And Ezra remembered how he had come to Briar Hollow 3 years ago, with nothing but a deed and a mule, and the hope that if he worked hard and kept quiet, the land would let him be. How he had buried his wife on a ridge overlooking the cottonwoods, and sworn he was done trying to save anyone. But fate, that merciless old hand, had a way of dragging a man back into the fire by the collar, and the sheriff's words still echoed in his ears from earlier that day. How they'd found her in the saloon alley with Jonah Pike's ring on her finger and his blood on her shoes. How Jonah was a good man with brothers and friends and a grave already dug. How someone had to answer for that, and how easy it was to choose the girl with no family, no claim, no one to stand up and say no, and now she was here, left for Ezra to see because he owned the wagon, because he was quiet and alone and therefore safe, or so they thought. And as he stepped closer, he saw the tremor running through her limbs, not fear anymore, but shock setting in, her body beginning to close its doors one by one, and he knelt despite himself, feeling the grit bite into his knees and the smell of iron and sweat and sun-baked wood wrapped around him. And he noticed the small details that made it impossible to look away, the way her left hand curled as if it remembered being held, the bruise blooming along her jaw in the shape of someone else's anger, the faint scar above her collarbone that spoke of a life already hard before this day. And he thought of how the town would sleep easier tonight knowing she'd been broken enough to fit their story, and something inside him, something long buried with his wife, shifted and cracked. And when he reached out, she flinched, but did not pull away, her eyes fixed on his as if daring him to finish what the others had started, and he felt the weight of her trust like a knife pressed against his ribs, because to touch her was to take responsibility, and responsibility was a road that never let you turn back. And he could hear the creak of the wagon behind her, the same wagon he'd used to haul grain and fence posts, now a witness to the town's cruelty. And he thought of how land remembered everything, how the soil held on to blood and footsteps long after people pretended they were gone. And he wondered what Briar Hollow would remember of this moment, and whether it would damn him or redeem him or simply swallow him whole. And when he slipped his coat around her shoulders, she sagged forward, her forehead pressing into his chest, her breath hot and uneven against his skin, and the closeness was unbearable. Not because of desire, but because of the raw humanity of it, the way her body shook, as if each tremor was a question she no longer had the strength to ask. And he heard someone behind him mutter that he should leave her, that it wasn't his business. That trouble followed women like her. And Ezra stood slowly, lifting her, with care, feeling how light she was, how close she was to being nothing at all. And as he turned, he saw the sheriff watching from the edge of the street, his face unreadable, his hand resting on his belt, as if waiting to see which way the scales would tip. And Ezra knew then that whatever he did next would mark him in this town forever. That saving her would make him an enemy, and abandoning her would make him a coward he could never outwork or outdrink. And the sun dipped lower, casting long, thick shadows that stretched like fingers across the dirt, and he felt her grip tighten weakly in his shirt, felt her whisper again, softer now, almost gone. And in that moment, with the town holding its breath and fate leaning in close, Ezra Cole took his first step away from the wagon, not knowing if he was carrying her toward salvation or straight into the grave they had already dug for her, and the silence that followed was heavier than any gunshot, because everyone understood that something had just been set in motion that would not be stopped easily, least of all by a lonely rancher who had sworn he was done, believing that mercy still had a place in the Wild West. Ezra Cole did not look back as he carried her out of Briar Hollow, because some places lose their power the moment you deny them your eyes, and the town, sensing that it had failed to finish what it started, stayed unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a bad decision, and the girl in his arms drifted in and out of consciousness as the road stretched thin and lonely under the dying light, her weight light but her presence heavy with consequence. And when they reached the edge of the cottonwoods near the dry creek bed, she stirred, fingers clutching weakly at his shirt, as if afraid the ground itself might betray her. And Ezra paused there, listening to the wind comb through the grass, like a voice from another life, thinking of the woman he had buried on the ridge, and how he had once promised her he would not harden, would not become the kind of man who mistook silence for peace. And he understood now that promises have a way of waiting patiently until they can no longer be ignored. And he laid the girl down gently inside the small hunting shack he kept for storms and sick livestock, a place that smelled of cedar and old smoke, and he cleaned her wounds with water he had hauled from the creek, his hand steady even as his chest ached with every shallow breath she took. And when she finally opened her eyes fully, she studied him with a mixture of fear and disbelief, as if expecting the cruelty to resume at any moment. And she told him her name was Leela May Harlow, spoken softly like a secret that had not been safe in a long time. And she told him she had come west chasing a promise made by a man who died 2 weeks after she arrived, leaving her stranded in a town that had no patience for grief or women who survived it. And Ezra listened without interrupting, because some stories only survive if they are allowed to finish themselves. And when she fell asleep at last, the kind of sleep that comes from exhaustion rather than peace, Ezra stepped outside and stared up at the stars, wondering how many men had looked at the same sky and decided to turn away instead of step forward. And he knew the sheriff would come, that the town would demand balance for Jonah Pike's death, even if the truth was buried with him. And when dawn broke, it came with hoofbeats and dust and the hollow authority of men who believed the law belonged to them. And Ezra stood in the doorway as the sheriff dismounted, riflemen fanning out like a judgment already decided. And the sheriff spoke of order and necessity, and how one life could not be allowed to disrupt the many. And Ezra answered quietly that order built on lies rots from the inside, and that if the town wanted Lila May, they would have to go through him and the land he owned outright. And there was a long moment where no one moved, where even the birds seemed to wait. And then Lila May appeared behind Ezra, unsteady but upright, her eyes clearer now, her voice carrying despite its softness, as she told them the truth of Jonah Pike, how he had cornered her, how the knife had been his, how survival had been her only crime. And something shifted then, not in the men with guns, but in the silence itself. Because truth has a way of settling where it is least welcome. And the sheriff, seeing the eyes of his deputies, the doubt creeping in where certainty had been, made the only choice left to a man whose power depended on belief. He backed away, not in defeat, but in calculation, muttering that the town would not forget. And Ezra knew that was the closest thing to mercy Briar Hollow would ever offer. And weeks passed, slow and deliberate, as wounds closed and strength returned, as Lila May learned the rhythms of the ranch and Ezra learned how to speak again without fear of loss. And they did not call what grew between them love. Not at first, because love felt too fragile a word for something built out of shared survival and quiet mornings, and the understanding that neither of them had been, saved alone. And when Lila May finally stood on the ridge where Ezra's wife lay buried, she placed a wildflower there and whispered, thanks to a woman she had never met. And Ezra felt something uncoil inside him, something like forgiveness. And Briar Hollow faded into memory. A cautionary tale carried on the wind, and the land, patient as ever, accepted them both. And if this story stirred something in you, If it reminded you that destiny is not always kind, but it is always watching, then stay. With us, subscribe to Western Destiny Tales, where forgotten souls find their voice and the Old West still has truths left to tell, because every story shared keeps the fire alive a little longer.